Welcome to Changing Suits. We're your hosts, Bal
and Taj, discussing the latest news, views, and general life for us Western Asians.
Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, changing_suits, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Hi, welcome to Changing Suits. My name's Bal.
And my name's Taj.
Today, we have a brilliant guest speaker. He is a deputy head and he has his own podcast. So he's going to be giving us his experiences of podcasting and the type of subjects that he discusses. We're going to introduce you to Amit Kalley. Now, Amit discusses a number of topics within his podcast in regards to mental health. And firstly, just a bit of an introduction, Amit. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, your personal life, and also what got you doing the podcast?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for having me. It's much appreciated. I guess, I'm a deputy head teacher, as you mentioned, at a secondary school in East London. Before that, I used to work as an assistant head at a school in Northwest London. So, I'm sort of London-based and have seen different society, the way society's evolved in London over time. And I guess the biggest thing I've had, so my sort of area of work is behavior, well-being, safeguarding, and that kind of remit. And the biggest thing that I've noticed actually over the last couple of years, certainly during the COVID lockdown, is that kids are making lots of mistakes, as kids do. We've all been there. We all make mistakes, and as adults we still do. But I think what's happened now is children, young people are living in two worlds. They're living in their physical world, which is the world that we all sort of live in, but they also live in their digital world, which is perhaps a world that we don't understand as much. We all have our phones and we all have our social media and all those things. And I will say very honestly, I'm addicted to my phone. I'm addicted to my digital kind of world, but I don't think that covers anywhere near the kind of addiction that young people face to their digital world. It's everything to them. And what I was seeing was that actually young people were making so many errors and so many mistakes in the digital world. And when those mistakes were being made, or were indeed made, parents were unable to support. And why was that? Well, it's because parents didn't understand. Parents had absolutely no understanding of what the digital world looked like or what the digital world meant to their children. So there was this huge disconnect between young people doing all of the things that they were doing on the digital world, 95% positive, but of course we only ever focus on the 5% negative.
On that point, Amit, you've said they were making mistakes. What are you referring to?
Oh gosh, all sorts. So working in secondary education, there's probably nothing that I haven't dealt with. We're talking about online grooming, so being victims of sexual predators online. We're talking about sharing of indecent images, so maybe being coerced into to sending images that would be seen as indecent. We're talking about cyberbullying. We're talking about all sorts of things, getting involved in drugs and youth crime. Most of that recruitment and things like that all takes place online now. Back in the days when perhaps we were at school, that kind of recruitment had to take place physically. If you were being recruited into a gang, it would have been a gang member approaching you. Now, you might never see a gang member in the whole recruitment process, but suddenly you're involved in a gang. So all sorts of things that young people were doing, especially in urban areas like London. London is a huge city, very multicultural, lots going on, and all that adds up to is the chances of young people making these errors are greater.
Did you find that through your job as being a deputy head teacher? How did you come to that conclusion? Obviously, it's always in the news, so you're always hearing things like this, and it seems to be getting worse, to be fair, from what we're hearing. But where did you hear about this?
It's all first-hand experience, yeah. I think I don't think I'd be as invested or as interested in this if I wasn't living it and breathing it every single day. So definitely, I guess, as I started getting into senior leadership at my previous school and now in this school that I'm at in East London, just simply and working in the mental health safeguarding kind of field, I'm exposed to all of these things that go on with young people and within families. So I guess that's just given me this kind of insight into all the things that young people are sort of doing today, mainly on social media and in their digital world, and those errors of judgment that they're making. Sometimes they lack the intellectual maturity to be able to make a correct decision. What you and I might justify, deem as being a correct decision, they may not be able to do that. Certainly, peer pressure is another thing. I didn't mention it earlier, but that's another thing we deal with on a regular basis.
Why do you think this is happening? Do you think teenagers aren't getting enough attention from parents? can we say the blame lies somewhere, or there's a root cause of it?
I think it would be unfair to lay blame squarely at one person's or one group of people's feet. I think that would be a bit simplistic. A simplistic way of looking at this. Yes, you could argue that parents, and the purpose of my podcast, What Do Parents Know? And the title is that classic thing that our kids say to us, don't they? Well, what do you know? So I sort of named it after that. And the idea is that actually, yeah, parents don't know very much because they haven't been exposed to it in the same way that their children are. And actually, they don't understand the digital world in the same way that their children do. And therefore, they don't recognize the importance that the digital world has to their children. So, for example, you might get a phone call from your child's school that says, actually, he posted an inappropriate image on social media today, or maybe he bullied somebody on Snapchat. Your immediate sanction at home might be, okay, phone is confiscated for a week. You're not using your phone. Your Snapchat account is being deleted. Now, parents listening might say that seems like a reasonable sanction or consequence. But actually, as a parent, are you appreciating the massive impact that is going to have on your child? That child of yours now is no longer going to be in all of the WhatsApp conversations that they're in. They're no longer going to be on those Snapchat groups that they're in. You're actually depriving them of their entire social circle. It's like, akin to cutting off an arm, basically. You're handicapping your child. And, I know not everybody looks at it that way, and that might be a slightly radical way of thinking. But, confiscating a phone, I don't think is necessarily always a proportionate response to a child doing something wrong online.
I just find it really interesting because the response that you said of, delete the Snapchat, I would have thought, yeah, it is now you've said that, you've raised the awareness, but it is a different world out there now, isn't it?
What would you say is the response to the scenario that you just told us? What should parents do if you're not because my immediate thing was confiscate the phone, etc. I don't know what other angle you would approach it. What would you say?
There's no straightforward answer, and I'm not saying, by the way, that confiscating the phone is not the right thing to do. In some circumstances, a parent may deem it the right thing to do, but actually, the purpose of my podcast, the purpose of What Do Parents Know, is actually to educate parents a bit more about some of the things that young people go through, because only through education as parents do we then understand why a young person might have sent a nude image of themselves to somebody else, or why a young person might have bullied somebody else online. And actually, it's all about communication. You need to be able to communicate with your child on their kind of level. But how do you communicate with your child on their level if you don't understand what their level is? So the first thing is educating yourself. The first thing is understanding, a bit more about what Snapchat means to a young child, or understanding a bit more about what trolling means, or understanding a bit more about how grooming takes place. Because if a young child is being groomed online, that process doesn't happen overnight. That process takes months and months, sometimes years, for the predator to get the young person's trust. Now, as a parent, you can blame your child, can't you? Well, you could say to your child, you saw the kind of messages he was sending you or she was sending you. Why would you respond?
Just to step in there, what is grooming?
Yeah, grooming is, any way in which young people online are basically taken advantage of by an adult. Often the adult portrays themselves as a younger person, and not always the case, but often that is what happens. And it's coercing that young person into doing things that young person normally wouldn't do, and that young person, in the back of their minds, knows is probably the wrong thing to do. But for whatever reason, that trust has been built up. Now, grooming can take place, as I mentioned, over months and years. To build a young person's trust, it can start off from things as small as, oh, you look really good today, or what you did today was really good. Moving on to, let me send you something. Your parents have taken your phone away. Don't worry, I'll send you a phone. You can use this one. It'll come with its own chip. Or, oh, you're being bullied at school for not having the best trainers. What trainers do you want? I'll send them on to you. You build that person's trust, and when you've got that trust, you'll find, sadly, that a lot of young people would be willing to then do anything for that person, including going against their own parents.
What are the signs of this happening? What can parents look out for?
Gosh, you're putting me on the spot there, because that's normally questions that I ask my guests on
Oh.
but I guess I've learned from many of the episodes, I've learned what some of those signs are. I think one of the key signs is that, has your child brought home anything new? Are there things in their room that you don't recognize? Because a 14-year-old, 15-year-old is probably not going to have the financial independence to buy things for themselves. So you'd probably be buying most of their things for them. But suddenly there's new trainers that have appeared, or they become very protective over their phone. And yes, part of that's being a teenager. You don't want to show your parents your phone. In the same way that adult, you might not show your child your phone. But actually, have they suddenly become overprotective about their WhatsApp conversations? Or are there people on their phone that you don't recognize? Are they talking about people whose names that you don't recognize? Are they communicating on Discord or these online gaming platforms and you hear voices that you don't recognize? All of these things you've got to pick up on. And as a parent, it's very easy to ignore. You go into the kitchen, you do what you got to do. You go into a lounge, you watch your own TV. But actually, you have to be alert as a parent. That is, being a parent today is just as hard as being a young person today, because you have to be extra alert to all of the things that that young people are exposed to.
Do you know what's really interesting? When we were younger, obviously the internet then started coming out and all this sort of stuff. You know, MSN Messenger from the good
Yeah,
old
yeah,
days, that
yeah.
sort of stuff. And the thing was, our parents being older, you know, from India or wherever they're from, never knew about this stuff.
Mm.
And now I'm finding that I have no idea. So you've just mentioned a few things there. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Mm.
And that's the scary thing. So we, you know, laugh at our parents for not knowing, well, not laugh because we're not that mean, but do you see what I mean? But it was humorous that we knew something that they didn't. And all of a sudden we're in the same seat, unless you're so on the social media. And firstly, I don't have enough time to know things are changing so quick. I'm in that position now.
I think there's a key difference there. When we were growing up, we might have argued that, we've got dissy parents, parents who don't necessarily understand. And, we didn't have social media then, did we? The biggest things we were hiding from them was coming home late from school because we were with our friends, or, maybe some of us were getting up to no good, and maybe some of us were doing things that we perhaps shouldn't have been doing. But ultimately, you could argue that growing up in the sort of 80s and 90s, perhaps, and for some of us before that, maybe it was a bit safer then because there wasn't this digital world. Actually, what we find now is young people, you think, okay, my child actually is at home straight away. He comes home at 4 o'clock, or she comes home at 4 o'clock, is in bed at 10 o'clock. But actually what's happening between that 4 o'clock and 10 o'clock is they're probably on their phone for 5 of those hours. And you're thinking it's just normal. They're playing games or they're just on WhatsApp. You have absolutely no idea who they're talking to, what they're doing, what's being said, what messages are being exchanged. And I'm not saying that parents suddenly now have to start filtering and all of that kind of stuff, because believe me, by the way, you can set all the filters that you want. Your kids are smarter than you. Fact. And your kids are going to navigate all of the Wi-Fi protections that you're going to put in place, all of the filters that you're going to put in place. Your kids will navigate. The key thing is communication. We can't go down the route that our parents might have gone with us, which is the kind of sanction-heavy route, because that's what this even they knew. Now it's actually more about, you need to communicate with your children and understand a bit more about, find out a bit about their world, and just try and support them through it, navigate them through it, talk them through it.
Do you think we've become softer as in parenting? Because our parents would have been, I'd say, harsher.
Given us the shit that if it came to it.
Yeah, of course.
Not that I promote that. But do you think that parenting has changed overall from the way our desi parents were and the way we parent?
Definitely. But I would argue that it's 100% evolved for the better, because, we as parents, I think, are a bit more worldly, and we know a bit more about what goes on out there. And that's just not just me as an educator, what people's jobs are. We just have a bit more of, the intuition is there a bit more, isn't there, about what goes on in the world. I think desi parents again, they didn't necessarily know what was going on out there. They just, especially if they were sort of working class, first generation immigrants, they were just all about earning the money to put food on the table for us to eat. So that was their main concern. But I think actually, as parents now, we do take greater interest in our children's studies, for example. We now go to their parents' evenings more. When I was growing up, Mum used to come to parents' evenings, and that was it. And even then, it was just I could just fob her off and just say, "Oh, it doesn't matter. It meant this, it meant that."
Oh, we all did it, didn't we?
You know what I mean? Exactly. But I think as parents, certainly those of us that are now sort of born and brought up in this society, we maintain our Western values, our Eastern values, our Indian values, but at the same time, we are very much Westernized in our thinking and our viewpoint. And I think that's for the better, because it means that we're able to communicate with our children better, and we can build, I think, stronger, more positive relationships with our. Of course, I'm generalizing massively. I'm not saying there weren't positive relationships then, but I just think we can do it better now on a greater level with our children.
With the fact that you said, understand who they're talking to, understand what's on their phone, this, that, and the other. The tough thing from a parent, and I'm going to ask your advice here, being a deputy head, you always get that thing of, when a child would have a journal or they had their diary. I mean, we had a workshop today. Don't look in their diary. It's their free flowing thoughts, and it's the same thing with your phone. We know how important our phones are to us. If my phone broke down right now, I'm telling you, I would not be a happy person. So how would you navigate that? Because it's the privacy of, we need to give our kids the respect of, they're living their lives. We should give that privacy. However, now the danger is not outside. It's now coming into our homes. So how would you balance that?
I think it comes back to a couple of things that I said earlier. One of them is knowledge. And actually, we have to educate ourselves on what some of those dangers are out there. And with that education, we need to educate our children. Now, as schools up and down the land do educate, and we do promote e-safety and all those things. But, there's only so much time in school days that we can do this. We should be doing much more of it, and we're not. But knowledge is key, education is key. And also then communication is key. You've got to be able to communicate with your young people, with your children better, and make them realize that actually, yes, you can make mistakes, and making mistakes is perfectly part of growing up. Okay, it's okay. So you should say to your children, it's okay to make those mistakes, but actually, let's sit down and have a conversation about why that mistake was made. How was that mistake made? And what can we now do to avoid that mistake happening again? And also, as parents, we're not experts. Just because I work in education doesn't make me an expert. Far from it. That's why I rely on all the guests on What Do Parents Know to kind of, help me and help other parents. We shouldn't be afraid. And I think this is another good point, isn't it, about the Asian community and ethnic minority communities. We don't like reaching out to organizations and authorities because it makes us feel inferior as parents. That actually, if we reach out to a charity, we reach out to the school, they're going to say, well, what kind of parents are they? They can't even look after their child. But, we need to move on from that nonsense. And that kind of, doing our own bisty or doing somebody else's bisty outside the house. Those days are long gone.
But do you think that's changed? Because if I've got an issue, I'm straight onto the email to the school saying this, that, they're talking to the teacher. Do you think that's changed from the past?
Yes and no. I think on the whole it has changed. I think if we talk about our community, I think some elements of it have moved forward, but there is still that bestie element. That kind of, if I reach out for help, it undermines my, or it makes people think that I'm a poor parent. And I wonder if that's mainly because those that have developed are maybe those that are second, third generation British, and maybe where it's still a bit stagnant are those that are first generation and perhaps haven't got that wider education yet. Again, I'm generalizing completely, and I'm not saying that people who've come from India or wherever else don't have that education. Many do, but I think there's still those strong cultural values that they hold on to. And in our communities, Asian communities and minority communities, some of those cultural values are very much parenting is done in the home, and we teach our children how to behave in the home. We do not talk about what happens in the home outside of the home, and if we do, it's our bestie, and that's where I think there's a bit of a problem. But we are moving towards a society where actually we're doing a much better job of talking. Thank God, mental health, it's now a normalized part of society, isn't it? We all talk about our mental health. Even men in our community, you think about our fathers and grandfathers ever talking about their mental health? Never. But I think we're doing much more of it now, and that's only to the benefit of our society.
But do you think on that point, I mean, it links back to something, the question Taj asked of, has parenting changed? Have we become softer? And all of a sudden, now we're talking about mental health. So how would you justify that, I guess?
I don't think we've become softer. No, I don't have that view. Just because we're not, I don't know about your parents, but I can certainly talk about some of the times that I was, hit over my back with the nearest object that Mum could find.
A Velna?
Exactly, and
You're just lucky it's not the dupper. It's fine.
But in those days, I guess it didn't make us love our parents any less, and in fact, we actually, sometimes you laugh, you look back on the stories and you laugh, don't you now? But of course, that's not something we advocate today, and it's not something I would ever dream of doing to my child, and I'm sure the same with your children. Parenting, we haven't, it's not a case of getting softer, it's a case of it's evolved. Parenting has evolved, and I think we have a greater understanding of some of the things that young people go through. We didn't talk about mental health in those days, that if a young person did feel, dare I say it, depressed, or if a young person had, for example, an eating disorder, or a young person, anything they might have been going through, the last people they probably would have turned to were their parents. And I find that so upsetting, because actually now we want to create a society where the first people young people turn to when they're feeling down should be their parents. And if that's happening, then that means we're getting better.
And in regards to mental health, how can we support our children with their mental health? Because we've had all of COVID, lockdowns, and it's all having an impact on everyone, no matter who you are. But we're talking about parenting. How can we support our teenagers with their mental health?
That's a really, really good question, and a really tricky one to answer, actually, because I'm sure there's going to be people listening who will, be saying that they've had many issues. I think one of the key things first is to make sure that we are on top of our own mental health as parents. We shouldn't neglect the fact that we also can be burnt out sometimes. We also can go through peaks and troughs. We also can have issues that we need help with. If we're not on top of our own mental health, or if we're not in what we might call good places, how on earth do we expect our children to be in good places, especially if our children are viewing some of our bad days, let's say, or our episodes, or whatever it is that we're going through. So I think that's really key. In terms of supporting our young people, it's about making sure that they know that they can come to you, and I think that's so important. We've got to create systems in our home where our children know that it's safe for them to talk to you as a parent about anything. Of course, there's always going to be things that are embarrassing, and certainly in our culture there might be some taboos. Your teenage son, for example, might not want to talk to you about how he's feeling towards a girl. And there are some things. Okay, maybe if he can't talk to you, maybe he'll talk to his dad. But at least, or maybe he'll talk to an older sibling, or to an auntie or an uncle or somebody. But there's got to be people in the family network that actually we young people feel safe and feel comfortable talking to. Because the worst thing you can do is create this gap between you and your child. That means that they don't have anyone to talk to. That means they're navigating this by themselves. And as a 14, 15-year-old, they're probably making some stupid, impulsive decisions that they think are right at the time. And ultimately what happens is 6 months down the line, you're dealt with a massive situation that is now out of control.
Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, changing_suits, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Generally, with teenagers, you go through a lot of hormone changes. And one of the things we didn't do when we were younger was talk about if you liked a boy, or if relationships. Do you think that's changed now? Do you think teenagers feel a bit more comfortable to speak to their parents about how they feel about the same sex or the opposite sex?
Yeah, definitely. Oh, no doubt about it. I think we've totally changed that narrative, and part of that is the Britishness in us, and this exposure to Western society. Whether it's what we watch on TV, it's what we see all around us, and what we hear in policy making, and what politicians sort of what they say, and thank God for it all, actually, because we're for the better. The idea that in this country you can be free to love who you want, I think, regardless of their gender, I think is wonderful. We as a community are probably quite a few years behind the sort of the English society, and there might be still some huge taboos. If your child came to you and said that actually, if they felt comfortable enough to say to you, they have questions about their sexuality, for example, let's say, if they can say that to you, my God, you've done well as a parent, because you've created a scenario where your child is dealing with probably what's been tormenting them inside, because some parts of society still tell them that it's wrong, and some parts of our culture still tell, because what they hear, don't they? It's what they hear at functions and whatever is wrong. But if you've created an atmosphere in your home where they can tell you honestly, whether it's same sex or whether it's even the sort of the typical heterosexual, Mum, I fancy this girl, or Mum, I fancy this boy. If they can say that to you, then bravo to you as a parent, because you've created a safe space for them to be able to do that. And it means then you're involved in that journey with them. You can not necessarily tell them what to do, because that would be wrong, but you can be involved in that journey. You can guide them, perhaps, and allow them to make their mistakes, but be there when their hearts might get broken.
One thing that's really interesting listening to you, I mean, one of the questions I was going to ask is, what do you find is the biggest difference of how parents from the Asian community tend to react to things versus people that are not Asian? And we always bring up, and I said this to Taj actually off air, I guess, where the issues are this. But can you give us some positives of actually, you know what, the Asian community has dealt with certain things in a positive way rather than the negative?
Yeah, I think there's much to celebrate about the Asian community. Sorry if I'm coming across negative. That's not my
No,
intention.
not at all. Not at all. It's only because I'm finding with the podcast, I think on the mental health, we're all well aware of the massive, massive issues that we as an Asian community are facing. And I think sometimes it gets lost of we're very lucky to have the two cultures. I mean, we always say we're part of this generation where we're part of the British plus, the Western and the Eastern. And it is a tough place to be. But we are lucky. Not only is it tough, but there are positives as well. And hopefully our kids are finding that as well.
No, of course there are. Of course there are. And actually, like I said at the very beginning, I think, 95%, that might be a bit high. I don't know what the sort of figure is, but, the vast majority of things that go on in our households are incredibly positive and are worth celebrating. And like I say, if you have created that home where your child feels comfortable enough, even in our society, in our culture, if they feel comfortable enough to come up to you and say they've got this feeling towards somebody at school, or, Mum, Dad, I think I've made a mistake online. I think I've sent a picture that I shouldn't have sent, or I think I've been speaking to somebody who I don't quite know who they are. Then those are things to celebrate. Those are things where you say as a parent, you know what, I've opened this door. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it's scary. Of course it is. Being a parent in the 21st century is very scary. So much so that some people choose not to be parents in the 21st century. It's just that scary.
I'm starting to question my decision after this conversation.
No, definitely no. I think there's lots of things that we do that are positive, and the fact that we're having this conversation now is one of those positives. 10 years ago, this podcast could never have happened. It would have been, and if it did happen, you wouldn't have had many listeners. The fact that I'm doing What Do Parents Know, although it's not tailored to a particular community, the idea is it's to open different communities' eyes up. And I think actually, as society, as a community, we've got our Sikh schools in the west and the east of London, up in Birmingham, Wolverhampton, different places. We've got Islamic schools, Jewish schools, Christian schools. Faith schools are all doing, many of them, not all of them, of course, but many of them are doing a great job in promoting better relationships and better communication between parents, and that all deserves celebration.
Having listened to your podcast of What Do Parents Know, you talk about some very intense subjects. What's been the feedback that you've got from your listeners?
It's a relatively new podcast, so we're still growing an audience. I'm still trying to grow that audience, but the sort of smallish audience I've got at the moment, actually the feedback's been pretty positive. I think, where I've had some feedback from parents, it's been very much, thank you for opening my eyes. I will try some of that, because what we try and do in our episodes is there's a bit of a theme. The person might talk about their lived experience, but then the person would also talk about signs that parents might need to spot. And then also we'll signpost parents to organizations and charities that they can go to. I'm not trying to give all the answers in a 35-minute podcast. I'm just trying to raise that awareness about a topic. For example, if I said to you CSE, would you necessarily know what I'm talking about?
No.
So CSE stands for child sexual exploitation. And it is something that happens a lot. And it's something that happens online, and it's something that can happen. And, I'm going to say it can happen to your child. It can happen to my child. And we could be great parents, and we could be really supportive and loving parents. But ultimately, our children, when they're online, enter this dangerous world, and they can be sexually exploited online, and then sexually exploited in the physical world. I remember doing a podcast episode on CSE with two girls from Telford, and they were from about the age of 13, 14, basically sold as sex slaves, I guess is the word you can use. They were sexually exploited, and they were raped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times by different men of all different communities. And they came from loving homes, they said, or one of them at least said she came from quite a loving middle-class home. So the problem that she said was that there wasn't that level of communication with her parents. Their parents were turning blind eyes to it, because as a parent, it's sometimes easier to bury your head in the sand than to ask your daughter to sit down and ask her if she's having sex when she's 14 years old. So I think what I'm trying to do with What Do Parents Know is I'm not trying to force things down people's throats. I'm not trying to force a liberal agenda down people's throats. Not at all. I'm just trying to open parents' eyes based on my experience as an educator. I'm trying to just open parents' eyes to some of the risks and dangers that are out there. And ultimately, the goal is to protect our children, right? So that's what I'm trying to do.
Another thing that's happening quite a lot is knife crime. How do you deal with this? And, how would you approach this? How, would you speak to the parents about it if you came across a teenager that was involved in knife crime?
Yeah, and sadly, in the city of London, certainly where I work in the east of London, knife crime is youth knife crime is some of the highest it is in the whole of the UK. I think we've now hit, or last year in 2021 was 30 deaths, I think, in teenagers through knife crime, and that's a record, or at least near a record, and that's a travesty because that's lives lost, including, by the way, the sad life of the young lad in our Sikh community that was lost in West London. And that obviously made social media waves in our community, in the Sikh community, but it happens in all communities. There's no discrimination here, is there, between people who carry knives and people who use knives and people who are victims. So it is a big thing, and I have had some guests on What Do Parents Know talking about knife crime, and actually what they said to me was, as young people, the first time they pick up a knife is usually because they feel threatened. They're either getting involved in some potential gang issues, or they're on the periphery of some gang issues, or they just want to intimidate somebody. And actually, what they tend to do is they pick up mum and dad's kind of knife from the kitchen, and mum and dad don't realize it's missing. They take it into school. They try to intimidate somebody, but of course, if you're going to intimidate somebody with a knife and they try and intimidate you back, you then, as a young person, have a decision to make, don't you? Do I back down and look like a coward, or do I go forward, knowing full well that one of us might end up using this knife? And sadly, all too often, it ends up with the latter there. And that is something that we do try and educate our young people about. But sadly, too many people on our streets carry knives. And that's something that needs to be dealt with right at the very top of government.
And why are teenagers getting drawn into gangs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of them feel that element of safety. Safety in numbers. Some of them, let's be really honest, it's part of where you grow up, isn't it? You might grow up in an area where gangs are prevalent, where gangs are on the streets, where gangs are operating, and you could be intimidated by them, you could be exploited by gangs. I mean, one of the guests I had on CCE, which is called child criminal exploitation, and this is how some of these gangs operate. I might tell, if I'm a gang leader, I might find a little youth who's a bit of a rogue getting into trouble. I might say to him, "Look, here's a bag of drugs. I want you to go and sell it to some guy. County lines. I want you to go and sell it to some guy in another town." And bring me back the money. What the young kid doesn't know is I've already arranged for that kid to get robbed. So he's now going off to sell these drugs. He's robbed and he's petrified because he's now got to explain to me, the gang leader, that he's lost my drugs. I now own this kid because he now owes me drugs and he now owes me money. So you get lured into gangs, and ultimately some people get involved in gangs almost against their will, because how else is this young guy going to pay me back? He's got to pay me back somehow, isn't he? Now I might send him out there to do other jobs for me, and that's how CCE often takes place and how county lines often takes place. So there's, often young people who are disillusioned with school. As a parent, you've got to know whether your kid is enjoying school. We're not all good at school. We have to accept that. Not everyone's academic. Not everyone's going to be your A-star student, no matter how much our Indian parents, want us to be doctors and lawyers, all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. We're not all going to be there. So we've got to find other talents in our young people, because we've all got talents. We've just got to find those talents. But if your child is disillusioned in school and is spending more and more time after school hanging around with people you don't know, that's when you've got to start asking those questions.
Do you think there's enough being done from the top, whether it's the government, whether it's the police, to stop these problems? I mean, like I said, you talk about some very intense subjects, whether it's grooming, whether it's gangs, whether it's domestic violence, whatever those issues are. Is there enough being done further up?
So as educators, we work closely, we sort of triangulate closely with the police and with MASH, the multi-agency safeguarding hubs. Every area has them. And if we have any safeguarding concerns, or any member of staff at the school has any safeguarding concerns, we can make a referral to the MASH team. And there is supposed to be this triangulation. And 95% of the time, it does work, because somebody picks up the issue. I'm thinking of some of the more catastrophic examples. Baby P is the most famous example, and more recently, the sort of the killings of some young kids by their parents or the people that are supposed to love them. Of course, things fall through the net, and you have these big inquiries as to why did this go wrong, and the school didn't pick up on these bruises, and or the school didn't pick up on the fact this child is involved in the gang, or the school didn't pick up on the fact this child is carrying a knife. The police did a stop and search. Why didn't they pick up on it? Yeah, you get all of that. But I think on the whole, the way in which safeguarding takes place, my biggest problem with safeguarding is the bureaucracy. And that's what I think puts people off. As educators, police, we've got to fill in paperwork. If we want to report something, there's paperwork to be filled in. And dare I say it, I reckon some people probably think, I can't be bothered with the paperwork today. I want to get home. I'll do it tomorrow. Tomorrow might be too late. And what's the reason you didn't report it? Well, because you didn't want to fill in a 16-page form about a kid, which is just filling in his details because you wanted to go home and spend time with your family. So I think the bureaucracy that we have is far too much. There's way too much red tape that we have to deal with some of these safeguarding issues. We just need a bit more action that needs to be done quicker. And also what we have is too many people scared to make a decision because if you make a decision that ends up being wrong, of course, it's on you, isn't it? So it's always a case of, oh, we'll pass it on to the police, or we'll pass it on to the school, or we'll pass it on to the local authority, or whoever it might be. And no one really, very rarely, but no one really wants to make that decision that's going to be in the best interest of the child because there's just that fear.
Do you think there's too much pressure on schools? We obviously grew up where our parents perhaps didn't know enough about the Western culture, so they pretty much left it to schools to talk about whether it's sex education, whether it was, how developing an education and things like that, how to be safe. Do you think that pressure has been added now, or do you think it's less than it used to be when we were in school?
I mean, I guess I can only compare what it was like being a student versus what it's like being an educator. Being a student, I guess I didn't really know much about what safeguarding meant. I don't recall getting too much information from our teachers and schools about what safeguarding was and who we should report issues to. But I guess were there less issues then? I don't know. I mean, I wasn't teaching then. All I can say is now safeguarding seems to take up all the time of safeguarding leads within schools and all the deputy safeguarding leads in schools. It's become such a huge issue, partly because of all that paperwork I mentioned already, but I think partly because there are just so many more issues going on, and a lot of that is related to we're seeing in schools. A lot of that is related to the digital world. It is related to things that are happening online. We're not dealing with so many things that happen in school as much as we're dealing with things that happen outside of school. For example, if you were, God forbid, you were the victim of bullying at school. When we were at school, if we were being bullied, at least we knew when we got home at 4 o'clock, the bullying would stop. We were safe at home. We were with our parents. We could socialize with our cousins, family, friends, siblings, whatever, and we wouldn't think about it until we wake up in the morning, and then we dread going to school. But actually now what happens is, yes, you might get some bullying in school, and you do get bullying in school, but actually when you go home 4 o'clock, first thing you do is you put your phone back on, or if it's on already, you look at your phone. You're being bullied online. You're being singled out in your Snapchat groups, in your TikToks, on your wherever, and actually the bullying just never stops. And what that's led to, I did another episode with Papyrus on What Do Parents Know? And Papyrus is the sort of, the country's leading teenage suicide prevention charity. And they talked about, the increase in teenage suicides that we're seeing. And, we're seeing them in minority communities. We're seeing them in minority communities more, partly because, I think it's partly because of what we talked about earlier, which is some families haven't got that, ability to communicate properly yet. But I also think, some teenagers who belong to communities feel that communal pressure. They have to meet certain standards. And if they feel that they can't meet those standards, if they're inferior to those standards, or there's cyberbullying that is just becoming relentless because it's happening at school and at home, the easiest way that young people think to get out of it, sadly, is to take their own lives.
I've got young kids myself, so I haven't hit that stage of them wanting a phone. They obviously want a phone, and complain when they don't get it, but I'm not at that stage. However, when I was younger, the whole mobile phone sort of craze started coming in, and I never got into it because I was the kind of person that never really asked my parents to get me a mobile phone, all that sort of stuff. I was never in that in crowd, I guess. But I was having a conversation with my husband. He was the opposite, where he'd get the latest mobile phone and he'd be the trendsetter, I guess. What advice would you give me as my kids grow up? Because I found that being ignorant of perhaps if someone was talking about me online, and I have been in situations where people are talking about me online for certain things, but because I don't know about it, it doesn't affect me. So would you then advise me not to perhaps give kids phones because they would never get into that situation? Or do you think they to be part of the network because everyone else has got a phone?
It's a really difficult one, isn't it? And as parents, I think we need to maintain some of our own autonomy on these decisions sometimes as well, and think about what we know our kids better than anybody else. We need to make decisions that we think might be in the best interest of our children. But I think you'll find it difficult, certainly towards the end of primary and in secondary. I mean, I don't know of any year 7 child that doesn't have a mobile phone. There's also another reason why parents now give their children phones, isn't it? And that's a safety element.
But
Actually,
I don't agree with this argument though, because the whole thing of, oh, it's for your safety, I need to know where you are. Well, you're more likely to get. This is what always confuses.
But you can track a child with the phone.
Well, but the safety side of it. Well, someone would try and go after that child for that phone. So it's a bit of a round circle. I never understood that.
It is. But what I hear from lots of parents is actually that it's a safety element, which is why I need to give them a phone. I need to, they're going to a school that might be in a bit of a rough area, catchment area. I didn't choose to send the kid to this school, and I need to know that the kid is safe. Does the child need the latest iPhone that's worth £1,500? That's obviously a parental decision.
Give them a Nokia.
Well, yeah, but then in all seriousness, I know that was a joke, but in all seriousness, there are parents that do that. But then you've got the risk of the child being bullied at school for having a phone that doesn't quite meet the standards of what's acceptable in year 7 or in year 8. I mean, it's a real, we're talking about this and we've been going for a little while now, but you can just get the sense of how difficult it is being a young person today. Thank God we grew up when we did, because we didn't have this, and that's why our children need far more support, and that communication has to be there far more.
That kind of argument was always there, perhaps not to the same extent. So although it wasn't about mobile phones, it would be about, I don't know, I can't even think of anything.
Trainers
or something silly like that. Or, does anyone want to have a quick smoke or whatever? It's just something silly like that, whether you wanted to be part of that crowd. So it was always there. But obviously it's more intense.
I think the key difference is that, again, that digital element, that actually, if you're not on, I mean, let's think about WhatsApp, for example. Assuming you're both on WhatsApp, we understand being on WhatsApp. Actually, I mean, I'm just, even through this podcast, I'm sort of looking down at my phone every now and then to see if I've got a message that I don't need to respond to it immediately. Of course I don't. But I feel like I want to, especially if I'm in a group. I don't want to open a group chat up and see that there's 200 messages. I've missed all the fun. Now, that's me as an adult. Now, you imagine a 13, 14-year-old, they're talking about how much they hate their teacher, or they're talking about the big event that happened at school today, the big fight that happened at school today. If you've missed out on all that content, you've missed out on the fun. We call it FOMO, fear of missing out. You've missed out on that banter. You then feel as an outsider. Some young people can't afford to feel like they're outsiders. They may already be outsiders, so they're desperate to get into the in crowd. Now, if they're missing out on all of that, they're on the outside. Now, if you're choosing not to give your child a phone, or if you're saying to your child, you're coming off WhatsApp or you're coming off Snapchat, like I said earlier on in the episode, you are depriving them of everything that they know. And we need to think as parents about some more creative consequences that we can put in place. I'm not saying phone confiscation, like I said at the beginning, is sometimes it is okay and sometimes it is appropriate, but we've got to just be a bit more creative about the way we implement consequences in our home, in the same way that we've got to be creative in the way that we implement rewards. A reward for our son or daughter doing well at school shouldn't be, you'll get the latest game on your phone. We've got to be a bit more creative about this and harness that positivity in a different way.
Sorry, so what should be the reward then, just out of interest?
Oh, no! I'm just here to give the.
I'm getting ideas now.
No. I'm just here to portray what I think should happen. I don't necessarily know what the exact answers are, because my child is 2 years old, so I'm not at the age yet where I've got to start thinking about that. But no, look, there are lots of ways. I mean, even things like days out, trips out. Your child might something trivial. They might love dinosaurs. They might have an interest in dinosaurs, and you think, well, okay, you know what? You've done really well at school. We're going to have a trip to the Natural History Museum, or you've done really well at school. Here's something related to dinosaurs that I'm gonna get for you. Actually, harness some of that positive energy that they've got. That doesn't necessarily rely only on the digital world. Yes, we can make the digital world positive for young people, but there are lots of other things that we can do as well. I mean, you might not think it, but even actually going out into London, for example, or out into the town with your child, that can be seen as a positive. They may give you the usual teenage, I don't want to spend time with my mum and dad. What do parents know? Boring. But actually, that's quality bonding time. And that's often an opportunity where you can speak to your children about some things that you're concerned about. And one of the key things, when you've got a concern about something, and one of the worst things you can say to your child is, look at me when I'm talking to you. because making eye contact with somebody when you're being told off is one of the hardest things to do. So actually, when you're walking down the street in London, you're not looking at each other, you're concentrating on your surroundings, but that might be a good place to say to your child, your teacher phoned me yesterday and just said that you're having a bit of trouble with this Snapchat issue. Why don't you tell me about it? You don't need to look me in the eye. You don't need to stop what you're doing. You can carry on eating the ice cream that you're eating, but your child might feel a bit more comfortable talking to you about what's going on rather than sitting them down in the living room just before they're going to have their dinner and saying, look at me, we need to talk about this right now. There are ways in which we can go about communicating with our children that makes it more effective and will make the outcome more positive.
It's all about the communication, isn't it? That's what's coming around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, without communication, there's nothing.
I've learnt so much, and some of it has just been really eye-opening. So thank you. It's been amazing.
No, absolute pleasure. Thank you. If we're feeling confused as parents, imagine what our young people are feeling as young people in this world. We just need to understand a bit more about what they're going through. And it all comes down to that communication. Educate yourself a bit more. There are courses that you can sign up to that are not going to take too much of your time. If your school runs e-safety evenings, if your school runs, go to them. Find out a bit more about what Snapchat means. You don't have to have a Snapchat account, but you might want to know what ghost mode means, for example. You don't have to have a Discord account, but you might want to know a bit more about how, I interviewed a lady called Lauren Lefebvre, and she started a foundation called the Breck Foundation, which is named after her son. Now, her son was groomed online by somebody on a gaming console for many, many months. He turned him against the parents. They finally agreed to meet up, and the young lad, Breck, in his naivety, I guess, bless him, went to meet this it was national news, it was over in Grays. He went to meet him in Grays in Essex. And the groomer, he slit the boy's throat. And that's the worst way. And obviously I'm catastrophizing there slightly because that is the worst case scenario. And thank God most cases don't happen in that way. But you ask the boy's mother, what she now has to go through, and the boy's father, what they have to go through, having lost their poor child, and of course what that poor child had to go through. So, it's just about, I don't want to catastrophize. I don't want to confuse people. I don't want to make people think, we're terrible parents. No, just keep abreast with what's going on. Just keep an interest in your child's daily life. Just keep an interest in your child's friendship groups. Just keep an interest in what your child is getting up to, even from afar slightly. And if you do feel as a parent with your intuition or parents that something isn't quite right, try and have that nice open dialogue in a scenario that makes your child feel comfortable. And that's not soft parenting. I think that's just proactive and positive parenting.
And on that point, Amit, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about these issues, because as Taj said, it's raised so much awareness. And just for the listeners, please do follow Amit on his Instagram.
It's at what_do parents know, and there's a Facebook group as well.
And also do tune in to his podcast, because you are going to be releasing your second season as well, which is called What Do Parents Know? Thanks very much, Amit. My name's Bal.
And my name's Taj.
Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, changing_suits, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.